Today on The Real Story, Governor Lamont's vaccine mandate for state employees now in effect. His executive powers also remain as well, but not without Republican pushback. Plus, the GOP's calls for getting tough on crime. A lot to talk about this morning with House Majority Leader, State Representative Jason Rojas, and House Minority Leader, State Representative Vince Candelora. Plus, online sports betting now underway in our state, but it's beginning with a soft launch. Only several hundred people able to participate for the next few days before it's opened up to everyone. So how is it going so far? The Commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Consumer Protection, Michelle Siegel, will join us this morning. It's all today on The Real Story. Good morning, and thanks for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Jen Bernstein. Lawmakers aren't in session at the moment, but there's still a lot going on. Governor Lamont's vaccine mandate for state employees is now in effect, and several people have already lost their jobs because of non-compliance with getting the vaccine or agreeing to weekly testing. And yes, we are now over a year and a half into the COVID pandemic, and Governor Lamont's executive power remains. And Republicans are far from happy about it. They believe this is overstepping and the legislature needs to regain control. On another front, there's been a few comments from House Republicans that have caused some jaws to drop here in our state. We're going to talk about that, plus their calls for getting tough on crime. A lot going on, so I'm glad to have our esteemed guests this morning, House Majority Leader Jason Rojas and House Minority Leader Vince Candelora. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning, Jen.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me today. I want to start with the vaccine mandate. Last count that I saw, 28 people had been fired. They were in the probationary period, but the majority of state employees have complied to either getting that vaccine or agreeing to weekly testing. So Representative Rojas, I want to start with you. How do you think it went? Do you feel like it was executed well?
Yeah, I think it went as smoothly as it could be. I mean, obviously, these as employers, right, and the state of Connecticut is an employer, just like private industry. It's always a difficult situation to try to require something like this. But employers have a responsibility to ensure that there's a safe working environment for as many employees as they can. And I think the governor in this situation choose to require a mandate. At where I work at Trinity College. We required mandates too for our employees, and we ended up with 98% compliance. And I think that's reflective of the general openness that the residents of the state of Connecticut have to being vaccinated, because they know that's the best way to ensure best public health and safety of everybody around them.
Representative Candelora, what do you think about it? I know some Republicans had issues with the government mandating these vaccines for state employees.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to take a step back. I think for congregate settings like nursing homes and college dormitories, that conversation makes sense. But when we have so many employees that are working virtually, why are you making this widespread mandate on our state employees? Our infection rates are remaining stable. You know, it's always about leveling the curve. And so the governor coming out with this mandated policy just for state employees, what I want to know is, what goal are we trying to achieve? What's the metric? If we have 96% compliance, why target that 4%? Because herd immunity, you know, is achieved at a lower rate. So I would just like to know what the rationale is. Where are we going with this? I'm more concerned with if boosters are approved, are we going to continue this policy? Because I think the public is eventually going to push back. So I would just like to hear from this governor what our plan is going forward.
Representative Rojas, has the governor given any indication of what that plan moving forward might look like?
No, I mean, I don't think that's a discussion. I think the governor has been taking the response to the pandemic on a day-to-day basis, given the changing dynamics that we've seen. You know, back in July, I think everybody in the state of Connecticut thought the pandemic was over. And then suddenly the Delta variant reared its head, right? And there's nothing to suggest that we won't see another variant. And I think that's where requiring mandates of everyone. And I think actually the vast majority of people who've been vaccinated would prefer that their colleagues also be vaccinated to try to ensure there's health. You know, even if you're vaccinated, you can spread it. It's far less likely to happen, but vaccinated individuals can continue to transmit COVID. So we want to ensure that everybody is vaccinated so that we can ensure the safety of everybody around us. And I know Representative Candelora made a reference to remote working. I think the preference for many employers is to have people back in the office. And I don't think we can get there until we address the psychology of it. I think the acute public health emergency, we're kind of well past it given where we are, but that doesn't mean that we're completely out of the woods. And that's why we have to remain vigilant.
Governor Lamont's executive powers still in effect right now. Representative Candelora, you all have continued to push back on this. Tell us what your stance is and why you feel like this is overstepping at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we just saw Connecticut is one of the safest places right now for COVID in the country. And, again, going back to what are the metrics? Back in May of 2020, the governor set forth a very specific plan on how to reopen the state of Connecticut. Everything has been reopened except for government. If you go into the Capitol building, the building is relatively closed. People aren't there. Yet we have our ballparks open. People are going to sporting events. They're going to weddings and socializing. No one is really as focused on COVID as government is. And I think this governor needs to start having that conversation of what is the metric to move government back to normal, because right now, to me, what I'm hearing from my constituents is that the achievement gap in learning right now, that those deficits are real. We need to address them. We need to address our economy, trying to reopen businesses. And this continual focus just on COVID, I think psychologically is not good for the state of Connecticut.
Representative Rojas, can you tell me an example of why the governor's executive orders and executive powers should be extended? Because we're saying it's for health and safety of the public. From your seat, can you give me an example of when that would come into play?
I think Representative Candelora just kind of answered that question, right? We are where we are because we've been able to work with the governor and give him the flexibility to be able to respond as needed to this pandemic, an ever-changing pandemic with conditions on the ground. I was responsible for managing our COVID response at the college, and I can tell you on a day-to-day basis, conditions were changing, things were changing, and we needed to be able to move quickly. That's not to say that a part-time legislature like we are can't convene fairly quickly, but I don't think that we should be waiting to coordinate 187 schedules to find a day where the vast majority of us are going to be available away from our jobs to be able to come up to the Capitol and act quickly and act on legislation. Our process was designed in such a way to be slow and very deliberate, and for good reason. And at the times of a public health emergency, and again, we're past the acute phase of it, but not completely out of it. We need a chief executive who can move quickly and respond as needed.
Representative Candelora, you want to address that before we move on topic?
I think what's failing us right now is we have a governor that provides no deliberation and no communication with the public, and these edicts come out and people don't understand them. So going back to these vaccine mandates, the question is, why are you doing that? And I think he has an obligation to come to the public and put forth a plan so we have a better understanding of how he's achieving this reopening of Connecticut. Both reopening our schools, reopening businesses, and reopening government. And at this point right now, we are just seeing these edicts coming down, to me, with not really any scientific measure. We have places like Israel that are recognizing natural immunity, yet the state of Connecticut still does not acknowledge natural immunity in this equation. And I think we have to start having that conversation, because with the infection rates so low in the hospitals, the hospitalization rates, Connecticut's doing a good job. So we need to take that grip off of the throat of the residents and let our state reopen.
All right, go ahead.
I don't know what throat or who's being impacted, right? We just acknowledged that people are going to baseball games and people are out at restaurants. The governor has issued very few new executive orders in the year 2021. The vast majority of them were issued in 2020. So I think he's been very cautious with his use of that executive authority and only used it when I think he really felt he needed to. But the world has largely opened up. Kids are back in school. Colleges are back in session. People went to yard goat games all summer. Even us on a bipartisan basis got together to go to a yard goats game, right? The world
That's right. Absolutely. But people are losing their jobs now. They're being fired. And I don't understand what the rationale for that is. We have 28 people being fired in the state of Connecticut with a population of 3.5 million. I would love to know why that's necessary in a state that has less than 250 people in the hospital.
And we know that there could be more because we know that the governor had said that they're hoping to put people on unpaid leave who have still not complied, but they wanted to reach out to every individual and make sure they understood what was going on and that there were no clerical errors. And as of right now, unless you both know something that I don't, it's up in the air what's going to happen with people who aren't on this probationary hiring situation. That's the 28 that were fired. They were more easily able to be fired because they were just hired by the state. They're in a probationary period and they don't have the same union protections.
Yeah, I think that's a really unfortunate situation for those families. But the other side of the coin is that 32,000 people chose to comply.
Okay,
yeah,
so
I don't think that should be the metric. I mean, that's the question here. What are we accomplishing by firing those 28 employees and other employees? That's what I want to hear from this governor. What is the goal? Because are we going to do this in the private sector now as well? Where is this going? Is there going to be a mandate for children to have to get the COVID vaccine like we saw with Governor Newsom in California? I want to know where he's going with this. And I think that's where there's a lot of tension, frustration, and fear from people in the general public. And the governor needs to answer these questions. And we should have done that before we gave carte blanche executive power to him all the way through February.
Now, the COVID vaccine for children is going to be very, very interesting when this starts getting authorized for like the school year for next year, right? Because I know a lot of people wondering if that's going to get mandated for public schools. What's your take on that? Representative Rojas, have you made a decision either way?
No, we have not made a decision. I think that's a discussion that we will have. It's hard to tell. We haven't polled our members exactly where they are on that issue. I think California is out there on their own in terms of moving in that direction, but that's not a conversation that we've had yet.
Okay. Representative Candelora, I would assume that you are not on board with mandating that for schools, or what's your take?
No, I think it needs to be the parental choice and a parental conversation. I sat in an event with a ER pediatrician doctor who had said that she's not vaccinating her children who are under the age of 11, given the risks and the risks of myocarditis. You know, she felt it wasn't necessary at this time. So I think we just have to tread very carefully. The federal government has said mandates don't work, and yet Connecticut is imposing mandates. And this is where I think the conversation has gone afoul. Connecticut was doing so well, and we saw the temperature now rise because the governor went down the path of mandate. And I don't know why he did it. I would love a better explanation from him. And now that he has that executive order through February, he doesn't really need to answer to anyone.
Talking about temperatures rising, I want to make sure we address this because we've had a few House Republicans say some comments over the last couple of months that have certainly sparked some controversy in our state. First, we had one of the representatives from Wolcott using the phrase, "I can't breathe," referencing George Floyd and his death, and saying that in relation to mask mandates, saying our children can't breathe, they cannot breathe in school with these masks on. That caused the Black and Puerto Rican caucus very upset about that. They felt like the comments comparing wearing masks, kids wearing masks in schools, comparing it to the death of George Floyd was wildly inappropriate. And then we recently had Representative Ann Dauphinais comparing Ned Lamont to Adolf Hitler over these vaccine mandates. She has not apologized for that. With this last case, we've had Republicans and Democrats speaking out against those comments about Governor Lamont, comparing him to Adolf Hitler. Representative Candelora, you were one of them. I mean, is this the direction the Republican Party is going? It's obviously a few small members, but what's your take on that? Because that's what people see and that's what people are hearing from some of your members.
Yeah, and I think sadly, we joined in a joint statement that all four caucuses signed on to. I think that's unprecedented. And I think the bigger issue is it's not just Republicans, it's sort of where society has gone. We've seen a lot of that hyper rhetoric in order to try to express a viewpoint. And the shock and awe is offensive and it hurts people. If you want to make your points, you could do it in an intelligent way without offending people. And I think it was unfortunate that those references were made. I was glad that all four caucuses have stood up to that because, I understand how that could be offensive. The underlying issues are very important, and we can make those points without making those kind of offensive comments.
Representative Rojas, were you, glad that Republican leadership also kind of stood up and said no with those comments?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, it's a disservice to all of us, Democrat, Republican, independent, unaffiliated. That kind of language really has no place in the work that we do. On a day-to-day basis, Representative Candelora and I and many of our colleagues in both of our caucuses work together constructively. What I think we're seeing is a carryover of the previous presidential administration, where they really normalized this kind of language and normalized this kind of rhetoric. And also the rise of social media has made people more comfortable with just attacking each other anonymously on social media, or even if you know somebody, it's a lot easier to say something mean to someone in writing and walk away from a keyboard as opposed to engaging each other in person. And that's manifested itself in this kind of behavior. I think people unconsciously and consciously use this language to try to make a point. And I also think it's a general lack of awareness on the part of some individuals and insensitivity, I think, to the plight of disenfranchised groups and minority groups and people of color. That has long been in this country and is a part of the history of this country, unfortunately, with the racism that we know exists in this country.
Well, I would like to say that I love the conversation we're having this morning. We have a Republican and Democrat in leadership coming together, and Connecticut does do this with our, caucus leaders, which is great. Having a discussion that's productive, everyone's stating their opinion, and it still being civil. I know both of you have always been like that, but it's good for Connecticut to see our leaders talking and trying to work together. So Representative Candelora, Representative Rojas, really appreciate you both coming on The Real Story. Always welcome back here again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Well, we have got more for you on this Sunday morning on The Real Story. Online sports betting now underway in our state. It's happening with a 7-day soft launch. Just several hundred people able to place their bets. So how is it going so far? When will you be able to place your bets if you're not part of that initial group? After the break, the Department of Consumer Protection Commissioner Michelle Siegel is our guest.